All right, guys, so we're going to start our crime scene notes. So it's a new unit this week. I started doing this the past couple weeks. I started posting your notes at the top of every week. So I'll continue to do that. So like this PowerPoint will be posted if you need to go back and look at it. I've also decided to start posting the fill in the blank notes that the in-person students do. They do fill in the blanks as I talk in class to this PowerPoint, whereas y'all have to watch the video. So it's like slightly different. But if you want those fill in the blank notes, just because you might have thought it might have been easier to study for your test, or you thought it might have been easier to like keep track of your vocabulary words, you're welcome to open up that fill in the blank that I have in there and actually fill it in as I'm doing these videos. Because I realized that might have been more helpful, because people in our in-person classes do use their fill in the blank. Like every time they have to answer a question, they get out their notes and check for it. Whereas y'all have to go and open the PowerPoint and like go through every slide. So it might be beneficial to you. I'm just not going to I'm not going to grade y'all's fill in the blank notes like I grade theirs, because I grade y'all's videos in Edpuzzle. Like that's how I'm getting your note grade, is that you watch the video and you answer the questions in Edpuzzle. Whereas the people in person are watching me do it and they're having to fill in the notes, and then they turn in their notes when they're done. So if you would like those fill in the blank notes, because it could be helpful to have, then you can print them out or just pull them up in a separate tab and like type them in. All right. So the goal of crime scene investigation is to recognize, document, and collect evidence of the crime scene. That's what we're moving into. It's just the proper way to collect evidence. There's a lot of special things you have to do to package evidence correctly, or to document evidence correctly. And then we're going to get into that in this unit. I usually do a big crime scene in my room at the end of this unit. I'm not sure how that's going to work for virtual students. I haven't really figured that part out yet. It's not going to happen this 6 weeks. So if you're planning to come back, you'd already be back by the time that happened. But if you weren't, then I'm still trying to play around with how that would work, because I usually set up a big crime scene and they have to go and like collect the evidence themselves and try to solve the crime. Now, we're going to talk about the Carb Exchange. So in our last unit, Edmund Locard, so this guy up here, Dr. Edmund Locard, he was the father of forensics. And you've actually already had this phrase talked about before. We're bringing it up again because he's definitely all about the crime scene. He was the first person to start a crime lab. So whenever two objects come in contact with one another, there's a cross transfer of physical evidence. So basically, before Edmund Locard, which was in the 1910 to 1920s, people just didn't really understand that anytime things came in contact, that we did transfer pieces of ourselves behind. It just wasn't a common thought to think that you're leaving your hair behind, or you're leaving your prints behind, or you're leaving your skin flecks behind, and that possibly all of that could be tested. And what affects how much evidence we can usually find is the intensity, the duration, and the nature of the materials in contact to determine how much is probably going to be transferred. So intensity meaning like how aggressively they were touching. Duration, so that's time limit, so how long. If it was a really short period of time, we're probably not going to find as much evidence. And then the nature of the material. So if it's a sticky or liquidy substance, a lot of times you can find more evidence, because that's just easier to spread around than like our skin cells, which is dry. All right, so the crime scene investigation team, these are the people that would actually go to the crime scene. So I've had a lot of kids be interested in being able to go. The first police officer, so obviously police officers go to the crime scene. Backup police, if they think they need backup. And pretty much anytime it's like a crime scene, they're going to want to have backup police there to make sure things are being done correctly. And sometimes the district attorney, who's going to be ahead of the case, comes. Medics are only going to be necessary if there's someone injured. If there's someone already deceased, then we don't need a medic. But if there's anyone injured, then medics. Investigator or detective. So sometimes those are already picked and they're already at the scene, sometimes not. A medical examiner, those are the people who do autopsies. So that's a pathologist. So if we're having a person who's already deceased, most of the time the medical examiner actually goes to tell the CSI investigators and the police officers how they want the body to be sent to them, if they need surrounding evidence to be sent with them as well, because they want to be a part of it to make sure that they get everything they need all around the body to get all the evidence they would need for the autopsy. And then last unit, I talked about how the photographers are the first people to go in. So like this person is taking pictures, they come in all dressed up because they don't want to leave any of their pieces of evidence behind, like contaminating the scene. And they're going to go in first. So like, yes, the first officer on the scene, like he's technically there first, but he's usually not going to walk around much because he doesn't want to contaminate or tamper with evidence. So then the photographers go in and take all the pictures to try to take pictures as the scene was found before anyone moves anything. And then the field evidence technicians or the CSI people, like that would be the ones that come in. So like the crime scene investigators come in to actually take in evidence. So like bag, tag, follow chain of custody. Now, lab experts sometimes have to come in. So like if you're an entomologist, then you might have to come in to collect bugs. But like that's only in like if there is a specific reason why you would have to come in. All must wear protective gear to prevent contamination in the crime scene. So everyone should be dressed out. A lot of times they don't show that on like any TV shows. They don't show them actually wearing these full up gears. They just walk in their like nice suits, and like normally you have to dress out before walking into a crime scene. Okay, so this is the actual most important part. Your worksheet is going to be classifying evidence into these categories. So you want to pay close attention to these vocab terms. These vocab terms actually stay with us the entire year. So most of our material we learn is kind of like in units, and you're not going to hear about that much about it in future units. But the crime scene unit is the one that probably will travel with us throughout the year. Most of the things we learn in this unit are things we always have to know because it's the basics of crime scene. Whereas in future units, like when I do fingerprinting, well, all the vocab terms for fingerprinting, you're not going to need in the blood spatter unit. Okay. But everything in this unit kind of travels with us and you always have to remember them. So you want to really know these vocab terms because they don't go away. So direct evidence versus circumstantial. So first off, every time you get a piece of evidence, you're going to first classify it as either being direct or circumstantial evidence. So a direct piece of evidence means that it's a first hand. So not second hand, not they heard about it, no, first hand. They saw it with their eyeballs, okay? So that would be like an eyewitness account. I saw that man shoot that man, saw it, okay? So an eyewitness account is direct evidence. A video would also count. So if you have like surveillance cameras that pick up the entire crime, well, now we are watching the video with our eyeballs, so we are directly seeing it. And then confessions. So if a person goes to the police station and says, I committed this crime this way, they were there. So they are their own eyewitness to their own crime. So that also would count as being direct. But literally just those three things: eyewitness accounts, videos, or confessions, and possibly like pictures. So if you had like multiple pictures taken that showed you the like progression of a crime, then that would also work. Now, circumstantial is everything else, okay? So circumstantial evidence is indirect evidence, meaning that all it can do is imply a fact, but does not directly prove it. So an example, we are finding a suspect's gun at the crime scene. It's circumstantial evidence that the suspect was there. So we go into a crime scene, there is a gun left there, we confiscate the gun, we figure out whose gun it belongs to. So it has it's registered to a person. It has the fingerprints of that person on the gun. So we're like, okay, we're pretty sure that person was there and the person has touched this gun. But does that prove that they shot them? No, we do not have video footage of them pulling the trigger. We just know it's their gun and we know their fingerprints are on the gun. So that's pretty good evidence. I'm not saying it's bad evidence, but it doesn't directly prove it. It just implies that it seems suspicious, but it doesn't prove it. We would probably need more evidence in court for them to actually think that was enough. Okay. Now, the rest of these three things, these three classifications are all about circumstantial. So we're not talking about video footage. We're not talking about that. We're saying we have found this evidence, like the gun we found. We found hair. You found a blood, a bloody footprint, or maybe just any kind of footprint or a fingerprint. Like if you found any of those evidence, that's all circumstantial. Like it's telling you the person was there, but it doesn't prove that they did anything wrong. It just proves they were there. So then I can further break down that circumstantial evidence into two more categories. Those two more are physical and biological. These are the two that people tend to always get right. It's the other ones they mix up. These ones are pretty obvious in the way they sound. So physical evidence means it's not from a living source. It's physical. So synthetic fibers, weapons, bullets, shell casing, paint, paint chips. So imprints, shoe prints, tool markings, soil, drugs or chemical, powders, stuff like that. All of those are not from a living source. So those are physical pieces of evidence. Then we have biological evidence, which is from a biological source. So a body, body parts, body fluids, hair, leaves, because it's not just body, it could be any living thing. So leaves or plant parts, anything from an animal, so animal hairs and fibers. Some fibers count, like there's a lot of our clothing materials that we make from cotton. Well, cotton was a living source. Also wool. Wool is from sheep's, so that's from a living source. So some fibers are actually biological. Feathers, wood. So anything that's from a living source is biological. This last part down here just says trace evidence. So trace evidence just means it's small. So this can be physical or biological, but it's just very, very small amounts of evidence. We have very, very little of it. So example, like a strand of hair. If you have one strand of hair, that is trace evidence. So I'm not gonna have y'all pick which things are traced very often. Just if you hear someone say it's trace evidence, that means we have very, very little of it. The more circumstantial evidence there is, the greater weight it carries. So if I'm in a court case and I do not have direct footage, I do not have direct evidence, all my evidence is circumstantial, that's when it's harder to convict, which is most of the time. I mean, how often do we really have a crime just completely on videotape? It doesn't happen that often. So most of the time you have circumstantial evidence where you have all these pieces of evidence that are pointing towards a suspect, but they don't prove they did it. They just prove they were there. So if you have a lot of circumstantial evidence, though, then we have greater weight. We're probably going to be able to move forward in the court case. If you only have one or two pieces of circumstantial evidence, usually that's not going to be enough to convince a jury. And if you can't find any more, then that person probably gets away with it, which is why forensic scientists want to be very good at their job, be extremely thorough, and get more and more and more circumstantial evidence pointing to the same person. All right, the last two categories you have to be able to separate is evidence can also be divided into class evidence or individual evidence. It's kind of like how it sounds, but I do have some kids who have a difficulty keeping them separate. So class evidence means it narrows your evidence down to a group of people. It doesn't narrow us down to one person. It narrows me down to a group of people that match that characteristic. So example, if I find blood at a crime scene, but I either don't have the funds to do a DNA test or it's not enough blood to do a DNA test. It's a small amount. So I could do a blood type test though. Now blood types, there's 8 blood types. Here's the breakdown of the percentages of people who have these types of blood. Let's say our blood type at the crime scene gives me A negative blood type. Well, that's 6.3% of the population. That narrows me down quite a bit. That's good. But it still is, if you have 6.3% of the entire world, that's still a lot of people. So that's going to be narrowing me down to a group of persons that could possibly be my suspect. So no other blood type am I going to be looking at. I'm going to be ignoring every other blood type there is because their blood was not found at the scene, but it's still a whole lot of people. It's still a group, okay? Now, individual evidence would obviously be better because it's going to narrow me down to one individual. So it narrows evidence down to a single person. So an example of that would be like a fingerprint. You find their fingerprint, you actually get their match in the fingerprint database, and it matches one person. If you have enough blood to run a DNA test and you get a DNA test and it matches someone, well, it matches that one person, okay? So that would be how you have individual evidence. I guess it doesn't say it here, so I'll say it before I move to the next slide. There is a way to make something that would be normally class evidence individual. So example of that would be, let's say our suspect is wearing a t-shirt, okay? He's at the crime scene. He's attacking the victim. And during the attack, the victim tears a shirt and has a piece of the shirt in his hands when they find him. And then later on, when they find that suspect, they find a bloody shirt in his closet or in his trash can or wherever it may be. And it's missing. It's missing that tear out of the piece of the shirt, and they match it from the one found at the crime scene, and it's a perfect match to the tear out. Okay, well now, normally a t-shirt would be class evidence because any group of people could have bought this shirt. This was a bought at, I don't remember, Target probably. Okay, so anyone who shops at Target could have this shirt. Whereas Individual, so now that suspect that has the exact same shirt that has the exact same tear mark, okay, now it's individual evidence. Like that definitely is the shirt that was at the crime scene. So sometimes things like that normally would be class evidence, like they have this t-shirt or they have that shoe print, that's normally class because more than one person could buy that shoe or buy that shirt or buy those pants or that jacket or whatever. But if they can match it exactly, like it fits the tear, or if the shoe print that was left behind was worn down in one spot, they were older shoes and it was worn down in one little area, and then the suspect shoe has the exact same worn down area. Okay, now it's individual evidence matching that one suspect. Okay, so we're gonna do a little practice example here. So determine the 3 types of evidence for this example, bloody fingerprints. So if I have bloody fingerprints, is that direct or circumstantial? It would be circumstantial, because remember, direct means they directly saw it. I'm at the crime scene later and finding bloody fingerprints. I don't know who left it there. I did not see them leave it there. I have no visual footage of it. I'm just finding the fingerprints now. So that's circumstantial. It doesn't prove that of why they were bleeding. It doesn't prove they did anything wrong. It just proves that you have their prints at the scene. So they were there. Now, physical versus biological. So physical means it's not from biological source. Biological means it's from a biological source. So we're talking about bloody fingerprints. So blood is a biological source. So this would be a biological piece of evidence. And lastly, I'm not sure if you can see it under this little box, but it says class versus individual. So class relates us to a group of people. Individual relates me to one person. Well, if I can get a match to these fingerprints, that's going to relate me to one person. So it's going to be individual evidence. Okay, so the importance of evidence is it can prove a crime has been committed and set the scene for the investigation. It can back up a witness testimony, like prove that the eyewitness is being factual because all the evidence is lining up with what they say, or make them false. Maybe they're lying if the evidence doesn't match what they're saying. Can link a suspect with a victim. So if we find pieces of that suspect on the victim or vice versa, it's linking them together at the same crime scene. It can identify, it can determine the identity of people associated with the crime. Okay, that's kind of the point. And then allows investigators to reconstruct the crime. So our whole purpose at the end of this crime scene unit is to be able to find evidence, piece it together, and reconstruct what we think happened during that crime. Having one piece of circumstantial evidence should not be enough for conviction, but having multiple pieces of circumstantial evidence, all linking to one suspect, increases the probable statistics that suspect is the one who committed the crime. So I'm not going to make us do the math on this, but there is a certain number breakdown that they could pull up in court saying if they have this, all these circumstantial evidences against them pointing to them, then there's going to be a 99% likelihood that it was them. All right, so all we're going to do is do this little practice, and then we're done. Oh, dang, I didn't put the little check marks in it. So you're just going to have to listen. So if I have a gun, I find a gun at the crime scene. Is that direct or circumstantial? That'd be circumstantial evidence. If I have, is it physical or biological? It's physical because it's not from a biological source. Trace? Nope. Trace, its gun isn't small. Class versus individual? Could be either. I'd have to give you more information. So if all I said was it was a gun, you don't know who it's registered to, then it'd be class, because anyone who had that kind of gun or could have bought that kind of gun is a suspect. If we do have it registered, then it could be an individual piece of evidence. I'm going to scroll down to written confession. So written confession, direct or circumstantial? Now it is a confession, so that's actually direct. So it's one of the very few times where direct is a thing. Eyewitness, video, or they confess because they were there and they did it. So he's confessing that he did it. So that is direct evidence. He's saying, I was there, I witnessed it because I did it. Is that physical or biological? Well, it's physical. It's just a piece of paper. Trace, no. Written confession would be on a sheet of paper. That's not small. Class versus individual. Now, since it is written confession, the fact that he hand wrote it, handwriting is actually individual evidence because we can individualize our different types of handwriting styles. All right, I'm going to do DNA. So DNA, is that direct versus circumstantial? It's circumstantial. Because again, just because we find their DNA there doesn't mean they murdered anyone. It just means that they were there It's not like, I mean, we go to people's houses all the time. What if a crime was committed after we'd been there and they find our DNA at the scene? Just because your DNA is at some place doesn't mean you did anything wrong. It just means your DNA is there. So that's circumstantial evidence. Then physical versus biological. Well, DNA has to come from something biological. So that's a biological source. Trace, I have to give you more information on where the DNA came from, because it came from a giant blood puddle. Well, then that's not trace. If it came from a little drop of blood, then that would be trace evidence, because trace just means small. Then class versus individual. So class versus individual. DNA is individualized per person. So yes, we all have our own DNA. So that would be individual evidence for sure. Okay, I'm going to stop there.